Imagine, if you will, a dust-caked, pockmarked truck, straight out of the mid-80s. It drives a gated road, backlit by the desert sunset, looking for all the world like a military haircut. Squared in the front, tapered off in the back. It's the American-made, high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle, the Humvee. And more likely than not, it's driving off to war. In the best of times, it's been the centerpiece of any military fortunate enough to keep it within their arsenal. And in the worst of times, it's been a piece of crap machine that's not just driven its operators crazy, but failed to keep them safe. For 40 years, the Humvee has defined conflicts around the world, and despite its coming retirement from the American military, its ubiquity doesn't appear to be changing anytime soon. Soldiers win battles, logistics wins wars. Such were the words of US Army General John J. Pershing, who, after seeing his countrymen through the First World War, would mentor up-and-coming young names like Dwight Eisenhower, George S. Patton, and Douglas MacArthur. Pershing was an innovative general who, despite a relative eagerness to wade into battles of attrition, oversaw the modernization of the US military into a 20th century fighting force. Of all General Pershing's contributions to the United States and its defense, perhaps one of his largest and most unheralded was his commitment to modern means of troop transportation: motorcycles, trucks, and most of all, armored cars. In Pershing's day, these were a major evolution in the theater of war, and they ensured that troops and supplies could be moved more safely at greater speeds and more cheaply than previous animal-dependent transport methods had ever done. Since Pershing's day, the United States' arsenal of light vehicles and troop carriers has seen several generations of upgrades: the Jeffrey Quad and Model T of World War I to the Bantam BRC-40 and Ford GPW or Jeep in World War II, and the Ford M151, which saw US troops through Vietnam to Kosovo. Each of them had their advantages and their disadvantages, and each of them was accompanied by light trucks, armor pieces, and a wide range of other US elements in the US military's vehicle fleet. At this time in the military's history, each vehicle was clearly specialized to fit its function, which had the dual effects of creating more demand for vehicles from American factories, while also greatly complicating military supply chains as they got closer to America's actual theaters of war. By the 1970s, the US Army had decided it was time for a change, with the Vietnam War helping to make it clear that many of their trucks and armored cars were starting to become outdated. But instead of discarding the current Jeeps and pickups for newer models, the Army was ready to try something new: a versatile, high-mobility vehicle, or one that would be a jack of all trades with a chassis that could be modified in the field to fit more specific needs. In 1979, the Army issued its call for a high-mobility, multi-purpose wheeled vehicle and added a few extra demands. Their vehicle would have to be able to handle on-road and off-road travel, carry a heavy payload, and withstand indirect fire while being able to climb inclines of 60%, hug a slope of 40%, and ford water that would be up to most people's neck or face. Although dozens of countries were interested in the contest, only 3 had the ability and willpower to create prototypes: AM General, Chrysler Defense, and Teledyne Continental. Eventually, it was AM General who received a contract for their design, and in 1983, they received an order for 2,300 of their HMMWV models, which would become the first Humvees to enter US service. The winning design had a gross vehicle weight of over 11,500 pounds, plus an additional payload of 3,350 pounds, with a top speed of 70 miles per hour. The vehicle used an engine produced by General Engine Products, an 8-cylinder diesel engine producing 190 horsepower at 3,400 revolutions a minute. AM General would go on to produce over 100,000 units over the next 12 years, most of which would go to the US Army. The Marine Corps also took a fairly large order, and as we'll discuss a bit later on, the United States' international partners have received a fair number of Humvees of their own. Before long, the Humvee became the backbone of the US military's ability to flex its muscle on land, to feed, supply, and reinforce its front lines, and to sustain any war effort in US-controlled spaces. The Humvee first saw action during Operation Just Cause, the US invasion of Panama in 1989, and though it was designed more for the military's transport needs behind the scenes, it did just fine when it was sent to the front lines. Known as Jeeps on steroids, US soldiers had already become fans of the Humvee while testing and learning to use the technology on their own bases. The design had proven very easy to modify, with troop carrier, ambulance, and command and control iterations already being built and developed. 2 years later, during the Gulf War in 1991, the Humvee took to the deserts and proved its worth, helping US forces secure their massive battlefield advantage. Operation Desert Storm was highly publicized, and with the Humvee passing this test with flying colors, the American public wanted a piece of the magic for themselves. The civilian version of the Humvee, known as the Hummer, went on sale in 1992, and over the following several years, General Motors turned the design from a hardy, badass truck of the desert to a gas-guzzling, extravagant symbol of what we can only describe as you money. And, well, the environment too, if it's absolutely crap mileage is any indicator. But we're not here to talk about the Hummer, we're here to talk about the equally gas-hungry Humvee, which gained even more positive press during 1993's Battle of Mogadishu. The battle's intense urban warfare saw a convoy of Humvees withstand an absolute shellacking from machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades, something they hadn't been designed to do, but in most cases, the Humvee's legendary chassis was able to get its passengers out safely. Engagements like this led the military to explore options to further reinforce the Humvee's design in order to keep its crew and systems safe in active combat. The solution was the M1109, initial attempt to add heavy armor to the vehicle, and then the M1114, or the up-armored Humvee, which revised the armor placements of the 1109. The 1114 was built to withstand mine explosions from the front, stop heavy ammunition from up to 100 yards away, and survive artillery blasts, while carrying a so-called ring mount from which a wide range of machine guns, grenade launchers, or miniguns could be attached, depending on the needs of its operators. Experimental units saw action in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and production line vehicles entered service in early 1996. For the rest of the 1990s, the Humvee continued to operate under the US military's watchful eye, assisting in combat missions, relief efforts, and anything else that military would ask of it. In these days, the Humvee was generally well liked by American soldiers who were grateful for its nearly impossible-to-flip design and its range of modifications. In fact, soldiers would often modify their Humvees to be lighter and quicker, with more carrying capacity, often taking off armor and even doors. This choice was a facet of what American troops expected from their combat engagements during this time: well-established hot zones and combat areas, and open space behind the front lines where they essentially had nothing to worry about. But as we're about to see, that situation wasn't going to last forever. The Humvee was one of the first pieces of American military hardware deployed in the War on Terror, and with its ability to traverse difficult mountainous terrain like that found in Afghanistan, it quickly became a staple of the invasion there. However, the battle space American soldiers found in Afghanistan and Iraq was critically different from the ones that they were used to, in an absolutely critical way, and that was IEDs, or improvised explosive devices, and they were absolutely everywhere. This is a particular issue for the Humvee, because IEDs exploited a major design flaw. The bottom of a Humvee is flat, and it rides low to the ground, with its forward and rear axles set into high wheel wells. The flat portion in between the wheels is largely unarmored, and this is precisely where the Humvee's occupants sit while traveling inside it. IEDs exploit that vulnerability by detonating while a Humvee is situated directly on top of it, sending the shockwave and the shrapnel directly into its most vulnerable point. This kind of blast leads to lacerations, broken bones, and loss of limbs. It can cause fires that severely burn the soldiers inside, and the force of the shockwave can cause concussion, blindness, and the rupture of internal organs. In a Humvee, the soldiers who experience the blast are too close to avoid those effects, and even if they were to be wearing blast helmets or Kevlar, the explosion is traveling up from underneath them, with shrapnel hitting the legs, feet, and posterior, while the shockwave travels up through the torso and the head. This was a devastating turn of events for US soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq, not least because when we say IEDs were everywhere, we really do mean it. On the front lines, in occupied villages, but also out on the roadside or placed at random in fields or foothills, sometimes lying in wait for years after enemy forces have moved on. And while IED blasts impacted many of the vehicles the US brought to the war, they were disproportionately effective against the Humvee because of all of the armoring issues that we talked about before. Of course, American soldiers in the field did the best they could to modify their Humvees against IED blasts, but the added armor made the trucks far more cumbersome while wearing on the chassis, which again hadn't really been designed with underside armor in mind. Armoring the top turret presented another set of issues, as this raised the Humvee's center of gravity and made rollovers substantially more likely. In 2007, the Marines replaced the Humvee with the MRAP vehicle, MRAP standing for Mine Resistant Ambush Protected, which should tell you a total of two things about how the MRAP was a more appropriate choice than the Humvee. By 2012, the Army declared that the Humvee wasn't fit for the sort of combat being fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, although it does bear repeating that the Humvee was never designed for a combat role in the first place. Unfortunately, the imagination of its designers were constrained by the types of combat they knew, and when Iraqi and Afghan insurgents changed the game, the Humvee was caught a step behind. Of course, just because the Humvee wasn't an ideal vehicle for the war on terror didn't mean that it could just be pulled off the battlefield. The US military simply didn't have another option, certainly not one that was better than the Marines' MRAP, which lost out on a lot of the Humvee's other advantages. So both before and after the Army declared them unfit for use, American soldiers did the best with what they had. And for soldiers in the field, that can only mean one thing: modification. At this point, the Humvee had been modified more ways than we could possibly count here, including many versions that weren't ready for the battlefield. At the very least, though, we can run through a few of the ones that really stand out. In addition to the armor kits that we've already discussed, Humvees have been modified as ambulances, missile carriers, mortar platforms, heavy shelter carriers to transport electronics or weapon systems, light reconnaissance vehicles, and higher numbers of troops or cargo, as well as propulsion methods that make it more mobile in mud or snow. This is all courtesy of that same chassis, which, despite its inability to withstand IEDs, can still take just about anything else that an army mechanic can bolt onto it. And as it turns out, the Humvee's known design vulnerabilities haven't been enough to dissuade foreign customers from picking up their own. As of now, the Humvee is in the military arsenal of 70 or more countries, with many of the smaller states with whom America maintains friendly relations receiving direct shipments. Recently, the United States sent hundreds of Humvees to Ukraine to assist in their defense against the ongoing Russian invasion, and many countries like Mexico, Iraq, Lebanon, Morocco, and Greece are using them as a linchpin to their own national defense. Many Humvees have also made their way into the hands of America's enemies, including hundreds that were captured in the Taliban takeover of Afghanistan and some 2,300 that the Islamic State captured during their expansion through Iraq and Syria. After they end their service life in the US, many Humvees have been auctioned or sold off to private owners at a handsome price, helping to recoup some of the value for the military's sake. As of now, tens of thousands of Humvees are still in use by the US military, but even though American soldiers are not currently deployed in large numbers in any combat zones, and we do record these a few weeks in advance, so please forgive us if there's some new massive war going on by the time this comes out, but this relative quiet for US troops hasn't led to complacency or where the Humvee is concerned. It's still an inadequate design for the demands of modern asymmetric warfare, and although the MRAP and other armored vehicles have been a good interim solution, the Humvee must be replaced for real at some point. And the replacement is the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, or JTLV, manufactured by Oshkosh Defense. An evolved design with a range of sleek upgrades and a significantly more durable chassis, the JTLV keeps the Humvee's agility and operational versatility while keeping troops as safe as an MRAP would. According to Congressman Mike Gallagher, quote, with the suspension system, you could be drinking a cup of coffee, going over massive bumps, and not spill. It's a critical modernization priority both for the Army and the Marine Corps. Safer coffee or not, the JTLV is unquestionably safer for its occupants than the Humvee, and while Humvees have been upgraded and reinforced as much as possible, even the best overhauls simply don't measure up. At present, the military doesn't intend to purchase as many JTLVs as they have Humvees, and as a result, the Humvee is expected to remain in active military use through at least 2050. Some of its more specific functions, especially its use as an ambulance, were harder to transfer over to the JTLV, so those modified versions might remain a bit more common. But overall, it's likely that the JTLV will be the vehicle that travels into future combat zones and is deployed to the enemy nations where American troops will fight their most unpredictable wars. The Humvee, by contrast, will do what it always was meant to do: ferry around troops and supplies in the backlines with no worry that it might drive over an IED in the process. There is one possible new evolution of the Humvee that's still worth discussing, though: its potential to be used as a drone. The Humvee has been suggested as an unmanned ground vehicle, or UGV, as opposed to an unmanned aerial vehicle, or UAV. A UGV could have a wide range of potential combat uses, with the implications of such a device largely untested in modern warfare. Unmanned Humvees could be used as scouts, transports, or even for suicide attacks, akin to the naval and aerial drones that we've seen used in Ukraine. This would keep American troops out of the line of fire while allowing heavy armor to be removed and making the Humvee mobile once again. As for when this might be deployed in a real-life battlefield, that's hard to say, but the conversation has been ongoing since at least 2018. The Humvee is a truly iconic piece of military hardware, a hardy, well-designed, and now nearly ubiquitous fixture of modern warfare. It has made the lives of troops and logisticians around the world easier. It has answered the call to war whenever that call has been issued, and it's going to be a central component to global militaries for decades to come. If we imagine the Humvee as an American soldier's loyal sidekick and companion in the field, then it is unquestionably a very good boy. But when we take into account the vulnerabilities of the Humvee's design, the critical holes in its defense that have been exploited, we must pay respect to the thousands of lives that have ended or been unimaginably changed as a result. But as military analysts and the Humvee's own operators point out, the Humvee was a product very much made by its time, a time that predated the quagmires of Afghanistan and Iraq. When used for missions it wasn't designed to complete, the Humvee has invariably done its best to keep up, but ultimately, it is a non-combat vehicle. When it is inserted into a combat role, the results are exactly what one would expect. In the 21st century, the Humvee's chassis simply isn't enough for the wars to come, at least not by itself. American soldiers, as well as those of America's allied nations, will be brought to the front lines of battle by newer, better vehicles, ones that are designed to reflect the lessons learned from the Humvee's flaws. But even still, the Humvee is far from a failed design and cannot be blamed for its inability to perform missions that it was never meant to accomplish. Instead, it is, as it's always been, the workhorse of the American military, and when it's given the missions it was meant to fulfill, it's a machine that holds up to expectations every single time.